9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Hold it! Hold it! That thing will never go anywhere. There. Now you can launch it.
To make consistent and accurate crosscuts on an MFT top such as this, you need two things: a guide rail for your track saw, and a solid, straight, and sturdy fence that can be reliably set 90 degrees to the before-mentioned guide rail. I decided to start with the guide rail. The first step is to figure out where I want my kerf line to be. The stock Festool MFT has about 25% of the work surface to the right of the kerf and 75% to the left. I decided to follow their lead with the proportions. I used dogs to square my rail to the table and then drew a pencil line to represent the kerf of the saw. Notice that the kerf is running right through a row of dog holes. Some guys avoid this by using spacers between the guide and the dogs or by simply squaring off the fence rather than the table itself. I've just always felt it was easier and more accurate to register straight off the dogs, and this table is so large that losing a row of holes is not really something that will affect me going forward. In any case, my old MFT table surface has lasted me about 2 years, which is pretty good given its usage, but I have so much time and money in this top that I'd like to extend its life as much as I can. One way I'm going to do this is by having a sacrificial throat. This was nerve-wracking to do. MDF usually machines really well, but I took no chances and put down some painter's tape where a tear-out could conceivably bite me. I then carefully cut some accurate spacers out of scrapped MFT top, registered them off the dogs, and clamped them down. Once this jig was set, I got out my router with a pattern bit and slowly, very slowly, using multiple passes, cut the 1/4 inch deep channel for my throat. With that out of the way, and after a deep sigh of relief, I got out 1/4 inch HDPE and snuck up on the 2 inch width of the channel. After a couple of trips to the table saw, I got it sized perfectly for a friction fit. And I'm super pleased with how this turned out. If you run your hand across the table with your eyes closed, you can just barely feel the transition from the table to the HDPE. So while I had this setup dialed in, I went ahead and cut a few extras. To finish off the insert, I got out my palm router and cut a bevel to match the existing one. It took a little cleaning up with the razor blade, but turned out pretty nice. Next, I tackled the guide rail itself. A few months back, I found a 75-inch rail at a pawn shop for only $1 an inch. I already had one, but it looked new and I couldn't turn down the price. Little did I know it would become the perfect candidate for the BF MFT. I cut the $225 guide rail down to fit with my $50 chop saw. Around this time, I got an email from Right Angle Design. They had seen one of my previous videos and asked if I would be interested in trying one of their prototype guide rail pivots that they are developing for their portable workbench products. I agreed and got this. Although it's just a prototype, the potential is huge. And as it sits, it's already a lot more robust and accurate than the stock pivot that comes with an MFT. So, tickled, I slid the pivot on one side of the table and the locator pin on the other. Then I simply installed the guide rail onto the pivot, slid the locating pin into the other end of the rail, installed some referencing dogs, and pressed the rail against them while I locked down both the pivot and the locator pin. And that was it. My pivoting guide rail was now 90 degrees to the dog holes on my table, and I could move on to figuring out the fence. This is 25 Series 8020. It's 25 millimeters wide by 50 millimeters tall, and there are two reasons that I've chosen to use this as my fence material. The first is that stock Festool flag stops fit this extrusion perfectly. The second has more to do with the way this webbing actually is in the extrusion itself. To illustrate, let's say that this is in fact my fence and my kerf line will be here, and I want to cut this piece of ply. Note that the last 7.5 inches of this workpiece is not supported by the fence once the guide rail is in place. So when you're cutting large sheet goods, this isn't really a problem, but it can be when you're cutting smaller stock. So I want to add fence support as close as I can to the kerf line. This is where the 25 series extrusion can help me. So you see this first webbing in the extrusion? The top of that webbing right there is about 9 millimeters from the bottom of the extrusion itself. So in theory, I should be able to machine this height off the extrusion to a 7.5-inch length or so to make room for the guide rail, and still have enough meat left on the bone to keep its rigidity down here. And since it's only 9 millimeters tall, I'll be able to cut anything taller than that with full fence support. So that's the idea anyway. I'm going to give it a shot, and hopefully this will all make more sense when you see it come together. The first thing to do was to install a blade designed to cut aluminum on my table saw. Then I put a mark on my table saw fence that signified the leading edge of the blade. This was a stop cut, so essentially I ran the 80-20 through the table saw until the mark on my table saw fence lined up with the layout line that I'd measured for on the 80-20. The pucker factor was pretty high here, but it went off without a hitch. I finished the cut with my chop saw and reciprocating saw, and then cleaned it all up with the file and sandpaper. The end result doesn't look as though it was done on a mill, but it actually turned out better than expected. So these are fence dogs, and it's pretty obvious how they work. T-nut goes into your 80-20, and then the dog goes into your table. I used 4 fence dogs to locate the fence, and then took out my gigantic and really versatile square from TSO to check for 90. It was perfect, and a quick test of the fence shows that I have support very close to the kerf line, and everything is matching up as it should. And with that done, I could move on to a little sidebar project that I've been mulling over in my head since work on this bench began. So I have this 1940s machinist lamp. I think Craftsman made it, but I happen to notice that the base has the same bolt pattern as one of those toggle clamp bases with the integrated bench dog. And what's cool is this allows me to put this lamp anywhere on the bench where I happen to need light, and it's been super functional. The only problem is I don't have power integrated into my bench, so I have to carry around this extension cord to get power to the light. And that's been fine, but I think I want to retrofit some power to this thing. My plan was to run power outlets to either side of the cabinet, as well as another inside the cabinet in the space between the sustainer banks, figuring this could be handy if I ever needed power inside a drawer or a sustainer. I started by nervously cutting holes into my side panels and then installing gang boxes. I then wired each with cable liberated from a really nice but surprisingly cheap 12-3 extension cord I got off of Amazon. From here, it was just a matter of running the cable through the cabinet, being careful to ensure that I didn't put it anywhere where it might be in jeopardy of getting cut or crimped in any way. The outlet located along the backbone of the bench would have been easier to do if I had planned to power the bench from the get-go, but I was able to get in there and get it done. And with everything all buttoned up, there are no visible wires, and I've got good, safe power to the bench. Something I didn't know would be so damned handy. And that's it. That's the BF MFT complete. I did, however, field a ton of questions from the Garage Journal while building this thing, and figured I would go into more detail on a separate video while answering those. I'll cover things like functionality, the pros and cons that I've discovered so far, and all the accessories I plan to use as well. So stay tuned for one last video on the BF MFT.
We're now coming to the moment, the last moments of Apollo 13 as it comes in, as it begins its re-entry. The best thing we can do now is just to listen and hope.